Hi everyone, welcome to the Growth Show. I'm very fortunate tonight to have Tom Pickering with us. Tom is a turnaround specialist, and I thought it'd be good to reach out to him to talk through what he's seeing out in the world right now and any advice he's got to leaders, VCs, PE firms out there right now. So Tom, thanks for joining us. Great to see you. How are things going at the moment?
Yeah, very good, Nick. Thanks. Yeah, busy. Lots of things going on. It's the ideal scenario, really, for our type of skill set. Oddly enough, the one characteristic of a turnaround is uncertainty, and there's plenty of uncertainty at the moment.
Yes, there is. And do you want to give the people at home a bit more on your background before we kick off?
Yeah, sure. So the last proper job I did was I was a vice president of a US tech firm, and since then I've always loved a challenge, and over the last 15 years I decided to form an organisation that's turned around 200 businesses, and we did this with having developed a capability from the start. Spent a couple of years doing that, trained 46 of the best people to do that. And oddly enough, actually, there aren't many people that really understand turnaround in the UK, and I'll try and explain what I mean by that. And since then, we've done 200 company turnarounds. We've consolidated the learning into a 35-minute program. So, it's very short and succinct. But I've got a huge experience of what goes wrong in organisations and why it goes wrong.
Yeah, and what are the main issues you're seeing right now?
I think the main issues we're seeing at the moment are really reading the new normal. So I think it's the tools that required to do that, as well as some of the perceptions of tech businesses and some of the impact of tech businesses, because it's hardly a utopia. So if I just sort of give you a bit of background in terms of some of the fundamentals that I observe to kick off. So I think if you take HSBC for example, they've recently axed 10,000 jobs, and yet a lot of top tech firms they're competing with are actually doing quite a lot of damage to the market pricing. And retail, for example, has got about 2 weeks before most of the retail industry actually collapses completely, albeit there is some good news in there. The interesting thing about this is these issues prior to COVID-19 were always there. And I've actually been talking about some of these issues quite vehemently over the last few years. So I think there's some of the misnomers in the mix here that I'll try and explain. So for example, the Amazon perspective on growth. So everybody wants to be an Amazon business, but actually statistically, there's absolutely no chance of that happening. And that's down to something called Price's Law. Furthermore, I think when you look at organizations like Revolut as well, it's all around the thinking, it's all around the mantras that are stated in these businesses. So Revolut CEO says that Revolut's expansion strategy has been fueled by substantial improvements in their profitability, which is a generalization. And the reality of that business is that they lost 33 million on 58 million sales. So the facts and the statements really don't stack up. And furthermore, the operating costs are increasing in that business as well. So, when you look at these businesses as well, despite the fact it's a tech business, they also employ thousands of people with relatively low turnover. So, and actually the reality of the Revolut business is it's effectively a debit card business, which is not hugely compelling. And its only revenue comes actually from transactions from signing up customers to debit cards. And if you take a slightly more sophisticated business like Starling, for example, Starling Bank, it's got a fantastic integrated product, but that said, they give away their core business. So the only way they make money, last time I looked at it, was through interest. So they've got this fantastic integrated service, which they give away. And that's really where the margin has traditionally come from in organizations. So despite the fact there's very low transactional costs, they're giving away that margin. Furthermore, we've done some work specifically in tech startups in the hub in Israel. And one of the mantras in that particular organisation, it was a mortgage organisation, was that it was a win-win situation both for the bank and also the customer, which just didn't make sense. It just sort of didn't sound right. And this business started off with 4 million quid. It even replaced its CEO, but the mantra never changed. So
Right.
it's very these mantras are very difficult to identify and actually very difficult to argue with. And even when you change leadership, they remain. And furthermore, there's a medical startup as well, which burnt 10 million quid over a 10-year period. And the mantra there was they couldn't create a plan. And yet, having arrived, identified this statement was the issue, addressed the issue, which is actually this statement. We created a plan, relaunched that product in 3 months, and launched the product that they required in the first place in 6 months. And that's a medically certified product. So, I think this is the sort of challenge in a lot of organizations. So the point I'm trying to make is actually tech businesses are far from a utopia. And I think what's interesting as well, there's a very interesting thing that's happened with the oil price crash just recently, which just shows how sensitive some of these markets are. And the interesting thing about oil was that oil was the only commodity that anybody invested in prior to tech. And actually nobody's now investing in tech because people are asking lots of big questions about these businesses and the viability moving forwards. Despite this fact, there's a bit of a spike at the end of March to meet the EIS tax benefits. Actually, the tech investments pretty much stopped. And yet the tech investors are talking about tech valuations holding up through this crisis as if things are sort of going to come out through the other side. So these are the sorts of statements, Nick, that actually really make a difference in organizations. And these are the sorts of statements that cover things up and mean that organizations aren't effectively pointing their gun in the right direction. I think the other thing is also when you look at China, people talk a lot about China. They have very little regard for our technology. And it's important to get other people's perspectives. So China technology our technology is far behind. What they're really interested in is scalable platforms to apply their technology. And there's a couple of examples of Farfetch, which has been invested in by the Chinese. And the investment schemes are very much geared up towards putting as much money into a startup from the word go, burning as much money, and then revaluing at a higher valuation based on the amount of money that's put in, despite the fact some of these businesses may never make a profit. So I guess overall, there's some really fundamental questions here, which I think are being asked, rightly so. I'd like to see a cleanup of this because there are some great opportunities. I think the reality is that quite a few of these businesses are what I describe as being parasitic. So when you look at fintech, 66% are purely payment businesses. So there's a real big question around, do the products make sense? What's the governance like in the organization? Does the business model actually make money? And will it ever make money? Because more of the same, if the business model is broken, actually turning the handle faster is not going to help a great deal.
Yeah.
There's a real gap here in terms of really providing the right sort of experience into these organizations to get these fundamentals right, because anybody can give something away at volume. Give me a job, I can do that. The challenge of any product really is is somebody willing to pay for it?
Yeah. And what are you experiencing from the leaders you've met? Because one thing I'm conscious of, there's a lot of leaders who have not been through a down cycle before. So they've always been in pure growth mode and now retrenching. What are you seeing from the leaders you're encountering?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Nick. So I think this is very unfamiliar territory. So a lot of this isn't recognized at all. So in good times, people aren't asking the difficult questions. They don't need to. And I think a lot of the rather sycophantic type of approach with political correctness and the like has actually made this an awful lot worse, where things got too easy and things got covered up en masse. And, so I think specifically, VCs are retrenching financially very hard, but they're not really making the operational changes and the people changes to really create profitable businesses moving forwards. I think some of the large tech cos that we're speaking to are worried about. A board member of a large tech co contacted me and said, "Look, I want to know how can we become fearless in the digital environment." So there's a real challenge with people actually speaking up and saying what they feel. I think there's also a state of denial as well when it comes to thinking that somehow when we're through this, we'll be okay. And that's the sort of statement that creates stasis, when in fact, when you look at the facts, and it's quite difficult to get to the facts, actually, there's pretty much a global downturn. This virus has affected everybody, and it's to the tune of about 30 to 40% of the GDP. And, retailers are really going to get hit very hard. Construction businesses are as well. And the auditors are saying, look, we're not going to sign off your accounts en masse. So it's a very, very serious problem. And so I think my concern with all of this is that leaders are not seeing or recognizing the opportunities as well. So some of the opportunities I've just described, which have become systemic in the organization around profitability, I think that there's some of the things that are coming to need to come to the fore, but leaders aren't still really sort of grasping that nettle. And I think the last thing is China is in the background, and I think there's a distinct danger that they may just come into the picture and just buy up all of the assets and that are left over at some sort of bargain price. So China has got a serious long-term plan. And the fact is as well that most UK CEOs only spend 3% of their time on medium to long-term issues, and the rest of it's sort of chasing their tails, doing things.
Right. Yes. And one of the things I would have thought is one of the issues I see with people is they just don't know where to start, right? I mean, you're right now you're running through cash flows, you're checking sustainability of your business, and you're very much, I guess, on the tools. The second you breathe to step back, working out where do you actually work on your business, that's where I think people will come unstuck at the moment, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think in a turnaround situation, people are absolutely desperate for clarity.
Right.
And it's surprising how unclear things become in organizations. So we studied this in the communication, and fairly innocuous statements can create a lot of unclarity. So people become absolutely desperate for clarity. They also become rather unloved as well. So I think the starting point really is to encourage transparent, open communication right from the word go, and make it clear that anybody can challenge anything that's said. And that really just creates a quantum shift. There's another thing as well in the turnaround where there are winners and losers. Okay, so you cannot adopt a consultative approach, otherwise you just end up with one very large fight, which is utterly unnecessary. So, and that encourages people to contribute to the plan. So, the consultant decide, and it's very important to set that out from the word go to be clear. Otherwise, people think that you're going against the culture, and that creates an issue of trust. A very simple thing as well when you're having a review is not to interrupt people. Let people finish saying what they're going to say, but also to take on new opportunities. Encourage people to take on new opportunities, step outside the box, and support them through that. So this is really about putting people first and getting back to basics. And the interesting thing about putting people first is if you put people first, they'll start putting you first, and that's seriously self-fulfilling. And that's one of the chapters actually in the winning thinking process, right from the word go, that people are quite unaware of, and it just creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. The second thing is to go for immediate implementation and engagement as well. And people are not naturally taught how to engage with each other. So if you say something to me, Nick, now how do I respond to you? No one really tells us or gives us a steer on that. And I think to also acknowledge the loss and fear. So there is fear involved in these situations. It's very important to understand the way fear works, and to describe what does good look like. Interesting enough, I think it's important to focus on the positives because your brain works far better positively. As it's pretty obvious, but actually the thing to be aware of now is actually previous successes. So we've run a number of seminars recently where people have been talking about even the near future, which is utterly obsolete. So it sounds like it's positive and building on other stuff, what's good in the past, but actually it's not. And the other thing is the core business. So what's difficult to replicate in the organization, that needs to be identified. That then is captured on a one page plan in a very simple format with the interconnections and the timeline. And then when you're engaging with people, when I'm walking around an organization, I ask people lots of questions, and I ask people different types of questions to see, where their aptitude is at. And we need people who are the big thinkers as well as the transactional people. Both are fine, but you get an idea of who can pick up complex things and who's better at looking after some of the transactional stuff. And from that point, you then give people things to do, and you start moving on all fronts. And you do this from the first few days, right? So this rarely takes any more than 2 days to do this. And of course, when you're giving people things to do, you can then see how they get on. And the way you do that's really important, because it's a fine dividing line between being extremely motivating and extremely threatening, particularly if they haven't met you before.
Yeah.
And so that balance, that's really where our expertise in terms of getting that right. But when you get that right, it's incredibly liberating, and you're actually you identify who the heroes are in the business and the people who are saying all the right things. In this process, you're encouraging immediate action. The other part of this as well is normally before a turnaround or a difficult situation, there's a whole raft of things that have happened which are really quite difficult to digest and really very difficult to make sense of. And it's important to forgive people for that. So you can actually create a clear, bit of clear water between the past and the future, and just focus on the future. And this, even when directors have behaved quite badly, it's quite possible to do that. And I find that very often, VCs end up firing the wrong people for that reason, because they are not able to sort of move forwards. They get stuck in the past.
Right. That's interesting. And I imagine, is your experience of this, is people mostly defensive when you come into a business? I mean, and also I'm quite impressed by the speed of how quickly you action. I always assumed you'd be spending almost like the first couple of weeks just assessing the business, but you're more one to actually move into actionable points straight away.
Yeah, I think it's really important, Nick, because you can't really ascertain people's capability unless you give them opportunities. And actually, if you're putting other people first, which is the very first chapter of the winning thinking process, then people are not going to object. If I start putting you first, Nick, you're not really going to object to what I'm going to ask you to do, and particularly if I know how to engage with you. And so when you get that right, and it's an imperfect process, because I'm as flawed as anybody else. As long as you acknowledge when you make mistakes and you know how to adjust accordingly, that's really key. But I think it's about getting the basics in place. So it is about getting identifying the core business, what's difficult to replicate. And the core business is difficult because this is stuff that people take for granted and they don't see it. And so it's a bit like your hair growing. It's a bit like your business, Nick. You're a very affable chap. And actually that's worth money, even though it's relatively intangible. But you've got very strong customer relationships, I guess. And that really is, that might well be part of your core business, which you take for granted. And, I'm an engineer by background, but I don't talk a huge amount about engineering. And I probably should, because I'm not a bad engineer. So I think the other side of this is also the work in progress, because it's differentiated between the work in progress and the business. So you might have some negative contracts or negative gross margin contracts, but in fact you shouldn't have taken on, but in fact your business is still good. When you actually look at the core business, it's defendable. It just so happens you've accepted some business that you shouldn't have done. And so and it's also about addressing the accumulated false truths. And what do I mean by that? It's really the things that organizations say. So VW, for example, wanted to be the largest car manufacturer in the world, which sounds very positive, but actually the implications for that guy on the shop floor who knew about the emissions scandal wasn't going to put his hand up. And so some of these statements can be quite positive, and that's a particularly positive one, but actually the implications are you're driving things underground. So it's about being aware of that. And also, when you get the core business right, it's about understanding what to stop doing. So one of the most brave things I ever do is not so much give people things to do from the word go, is actually say, look, this is what I want you to do, but please don't do anything else. And that you don't quite know if you get that right, but just by creating that line in the sand, what you do when you do that is you create a huge amount of time. And I've freed up entire leadership teams doing that, and provided a huge amount of capacity and set up war rooms, as I call them, with flip charts all over the walls where people are actually working and freed up from their previous duties, whatever they were doing. So I think, and then you allocate the task and the timeline, you delegate the how. And I often say, look, I don't care how you create the plan. And there's a lot of focus at the moment on all these IT related systems and stuff to report progress and what have you. To me, that actually has exactly the opposite effect, because what you want people to do is do nothing else apart from think and own the plan. So if someone writes it on the back of a fag packet, I really don't care, Nick. They have to report on that plan, right?
Yeah.
So not that they're not accountable. We've got a way of reporting on it. And it's about also supporting people in these situations. So it's not training, it's actually letting people do it. And actually that's quite unique. Actually letting people give someone something to do and actually let them do it and actually know how to engage with them is really quite a unique thing. And within all of this, the organisation has got to, in that free time, they've got to start looking outside their organisation and stop reinventing wheels. So, in a recruitment business, what are the parallel businesses that are faced with the same challenges? If you're running a recruitment business, and this is what one of the things we do. We put people out of sector who have got a broad sector experience, so they're bringing a huge amount of knowledge, which frankly we can copy from other places that we know works. And we intentionally break the norms in that way, because that then, otherwise that can be a limiting factor as well.
Right. And I guess if they're coming from a different sector, they're learning, there's no assumptions being made. They still know how to deal with the human interaction and sort of clarity of message. They're maybe digging deeper, right? Yeah.
I think the point with that, Nick, is it's not that we haven't got sector experience. So I've turned around quite a few retailers, but in the mix, I've turned around aerospace businesses. I mean, you name it, pretty much, apart from property businesses. So it's not that we don't know it; it's just that we've got more experience from that sector, and/or there are situations where there's some specialists. So around digital marketing, for example, I've got some people who are really very good at digital marketing, who you can deploy in pretty much any situation, without necessarily having the breadth of experience to do everything else. And that's okay. And actually, the starting point is the organisation has got a lot more knowledge than it's given credit for. So it's about leveraging that knowledge, and it's about not reinventing wheels. It's about opening up opportunities and making sure they don't get shut down. And I think the other thing is, a lot of people, when they're talking about turnaround, is restructuring and chopping costs back. Actually, that creates a relatively listless business, and it's a bit like being hit. It's a sort of experience that you don't forget, and it's actually not very constructive at all. And actually, what I'm describing is the things that you do in addition, because you still have to get the business to if the revenue is dropping, you have to cut the cost base. But these are things you need to do concurrently, because just simply cutting the cost base, I've never seen a business make profit just by cutting the cost base. You create this sort of listless, cash hemorrhaging situation, which is very difficult to deal with.
Yes, like a penny saved, not a penny earned, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, we do see a number of people taking that approach, and that's what I think. What's interesting from what you're saying here is getting some of the leaders maybe just to step back and remove themselves from the endless array of spreadsheets they're going to be buried in right now, while they're focusing on saving the business. And what advice would you give to them on like where to start this process? Like where do they is this where they just dig up every element of change they've wanted to get through their business over the last sort of 5-10 years, sort of gain back some control? What's the engagement they want with the management team? How do they help clarify that message as well through communication? Is it to the whole wider business, or do they try and keep it just to a management team?
Good question. I think the starting point, the first question I ask is to ask, what are the challenges that organisations have faced over the last 5 years? What were the actions that were taken? And then you can see the thinking and how they've got to where they've got to. And from that point, you can actually identify what's driven that business and got it to where has got to. And then from that point, these are some of the points I've just been talking about. So it's vitally important to understand if the business is severely challenged, what's the core business? And even if it isn't challenged, the tech businesses I just described give away a lot of value, and there's no reason for that. Why not make money? I think the team aspects. And so having done that, it doesn't take very long. You can then very quickly get a grip on actually where is it now and where does it need to be, and identify the actions in a relatively imperfect, top level sort of way, at a very high level degree of detail, and then you can start cascading and refining those and delegating the how and developing the what right from the word go. So then you can start seeing what people are capable of doing. But as I say, if you don't set out what you want people to do, you can't say, actually, this is what I don't want you to do. So you made the point about people's time and other things. Of course, people are busy. Everybody thinks they're busy, but the challenge is what you're going to stop to do. So this is why it's important to understand the core business, because if you take a Revolut business, there's a whole raft. They've got 3,000 employees, and in my view, they shouldn't be running customer service departments, and they are. And so that's a complete distraction. It's not part of that. In my view, it's not part of their core business. It shouldn't be. And a lot of businesses attract that sort of clutter. And when you decide what you are going to do, that creates a space to then say, right, to do other things and really start motoring and really start making money. So I think the other thing is that people do not naturally do this themselves, Nick, because if you're developing the organization, it's like redefining the vehicle, and people are worried about who they're speaking to and the relationships and the existing situation. So you've got to bring people together, because they don't do that naturally. So you have to sort of put the structure in place. And I call the organization, it's a bit like a vehicle. It's, is it fit for going around a racetrack or climbing a mountain? Is it the right vehicle for the road? And there's a review structure that sits around that. So you can start this, as I say, one of the great challenges, I think, is expecting to have a silver bullet. There's no silver bullet. It's just about trying to clear out the debris, identify where the organization's stuck, and create that focus, as I just said, to free up the time and and actually really start implementing things as well, and take away all the excuses for not making things happen.
Yeah. And what would you say to the CEO who's just buried in cash flow models at the moment? Do you think CEOs are equipped to even be dealing with half those models half the time?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So cash flow is absolutely paramount importance. So cash flow is the engine of the business. It's the lifeblood of a business. But cash flow is only as good as the teamwork. So my view of cash flow, it's the outcome of good teamwork. So if I delegate something to you or another team member, I'll say, right, you've got $5,000 and come back and fix it for me on Tuesday. And actually, if you do $4,500 or $5,500, then there's a review structure that sits behind that. So you've got predictable cash. I think certainly in a difficult situation, you have to technically get the cash right. So if you can't meet your payments on time, then you're in an insolvency situation. You need to start behaving in a different way, because the focus moves to the need to take formal advice from an insolvency practitioner, and the focus moves from the shareholders to the creditors, and that is a whole different world, and that's a whole different responsibility, and it's extremely litigious. So there's some issues around that in terms of the COVID-19 reprieve that's just been led, but actually there's still directors' responsibilities that sit underneath that, and very few people understand either the Insolvency Act 1986 or Companies Act 2006. A lot of it's common sense. If people know, I think, if they're doing something right or wrong. And there's a couple of clangers in there as well, like pension scheme deficits, which have been a threat to quite a few businesses, have all of a sudden, because of COVID-19, become reared their ugly head. There's 140 billion deficit now on pension scheme deficits. So, and I think the other part of this is, when I talked about the core business, it's then about defining the activity-based costing model. So what part of the business is making money, what part of the business is losing money, and that then defines the commercial model for taking on new work. So there's then a template to see, a cookie cutter to see, if we get this piece of work, what's the margin, and sign it off. So you've got some control. So that's one of the first things I ever do in a in any business, actually, regardless if it's a turnaround or anything else, to say, well, what sort of business are you taking on? It sounds pretty obvious, and you put some ground rules in there in terms of gross margin, etc., and how that fits in. So and then you sign this stuff off. So and if you have bad work in progress, as I mentioned before, you need to really renegotiate that and avoid shortcuts to cash. So there are some asset-based lending deals which look very attractive, but actually will create severe problems if there's a downturn. A lot of business owners don't understand the dynamic of asset-based lending. It's okay if you're growing, but when the revenue drops, the cash flow can really be badly impacted. So there's a pragmatic aspect to cash flow, which is it's like, and I've got a really strong feel for it. So I often speak to VCs, and I said to a VC in a very large retailer where the revenue dropped from 480 million to 140 million in 6 months in the 2008 crash. I said to the VC, I looked around, I said to the VC, this business is going bust in the middle of February. Just looking at the big numbers and where things were stuck and where the invoices were, and etc. And sure enough, it did. And that then provided the next part of the restructure and breakup, which was the next part of the process in that particular situation. So, and I think the other thing is, in all these things, it's what's the single key performance indicator. If someone's stuck, if you're wondering what to do, Nick, there should always be one KPI. And one thing I quite like is customer back orders. So if a business has no customer back orders and everything's been processed, and that's actually quite a good place to be. And that's one metric which I think works quite well. And I think it's just the reporting process that sits around that, sticking to the budget and making sure that things are escalated in time before they become issues. And I think that's probably the one ground rule which I put in place. Say, look, if I give you something to do and you can't do it, please tell me before you meet the deadline, so we've got time to correct it. So you've got this feedback loop before nasty surprises come out the woodwork.
Right, which I imagine not everyone does. I imagine some people just stick to the deadline, come back and say it didn't work and I failed.
Yeah, and it's about approachability, Nick. So it's remarkable how unapproachable leaders are. When I think about my career in boardrooms, early on, I was a director of an automotive company when I was 28, and it was my ambition, but just the whole reality of it was just appalling. To be honest, and terrifying automotive boss who, the last person you'd ever. When I was the PA, you always used to say I was the only person ever stood up to him, which was interesting. But that's the reality. It's very, a lot of leaders are quite unapproachable, and there's a lot of things that don't get discussed, and that's part of the reason why the Olympics. When there was 10,000 security guards, no one had the courage to tell the boss, because that boss was pretty terrifying.
Yeah. And what's your advice? I mean, I know a lot of this conversation is focused around leaders, but for me, this is the opportunity for the up-and-coming leaders really to add value, step up, actually show they are the future leaders of this business.
Yeah.
Have you got any advice for them or how they should sort of navigate these sort of times?
Yeah, I think there's a great opportunity. I think there's lots of positive opportunities. So that some of the things I'm talking about are really quite simple. About putting people first, creating a simple plan, encouraging action, developing the skills to become approachable, being and getting a grip on the financials. So, I mean, one thing, even if something's absolutely disastrously going wrong, you feel so much better if you know what the cash flow is. And I find so many leadership teams are, just haven't got the courage, frankly, to get to grips with it. And I mean, there's real legal issues. I mean, the shortest time that any director's gone to prison, having joined an organisation for trading to the detriment of creditors, is only 10 days. So there's a real sense of urgency legally to understand what the cash position is and if that business is insolvent or not. So cash flow is not a nice to have. And this basic governance, I think, is lacking in a lot of organisations, but it creates a lot of time and space and mind space to enable you to get on and do other stuff. So I think this stuff is pretty straightforward. I think a one-page plan is really important. It's important not to tell people what to do because people stop thinking. And I think it's about developing the accountability. So when you're having reviews, where are the gaps? How can you develop the accountability of the team? Who can take on more responsibility in a positive way and actually let people do things in their own way? So when you let people do things in their own way, it actually reduces their stress because it realigns their actions and their beliefs. So if I tell you how to do something, it's going to bend you out of shape. But if I say, look, and I know that you're the right person to do it, then you're not going to push back. So when you get that right, it's really quite exciting. And I think, particularly for young leaders, it's very high octane, exciting territory. So I think it's a great place to be. And it gives you the time, when you get on top of the governance and the teamwork, it really gives you the time to do some really high value work.
Yeah, and the communication, are you an advocate of manage through others, or one big message broadcast across the whole of the business?
Yeah, really good question. I remember quite early on in my career speaking to lots of people and thinking it was an absolute waste of time. And I've run large organisations, and you're speaking from everybody to the senior management down to the shop floor and everybody in between, and they've all got different interests. So I think it's disrespectful to do that. I think there's a time and a place to do that, but actually I think you've got to have different layers, and a lot of this stuff is going to be communicated through line managers who can deal with this information themselves. It's very important you don't undermine people, and people just come to you rather than go to the line manager. So throughout this process, it needs to be cascaded very carefully, and again, let the leaders do their own thing largely without broadcasting some blasé message, which frankly they never really apply. It struck me that it doesn't apply to anybody. I remember talking about the company financials and presenting the latest board report to the whole business, and I think no one's interested in this, not even me. So I think it's I think you delegate it through the ranks, but I think the other thing is that I'm always approachable. So if anybody ever stops me on the shop floor, even though I might be the boss, I always stop and make time and understand what and if someone's not pulling the weight, to make sure people are supporting each other. So I certainly don't take any prisoners.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
And how do you plan transitioning out of the business?
That's really around developing the capability. So the answer is as soon as possible. So I have done turnarounds in 2 weeks. I've got business back to profit from a serious cash hemorrhaging situations in 2 weeks. Because when you get this right, Nick, it basically develops a life of its own. And that is, so that's been my focus actually ever since I was about 20, is to get into a situation and get out and do something more interesting personally. So that's been one of my drivers for a long time. So I've thought very hard about that, but it's just about giving people opportunities, engaging with them in the way I've just tried to describe.
Right, and if you're leading one of these businesses, how do you go about engaging with someone like yourself? It's quite. Is it a full-on engagement? Is there like a softer touch to sort of work through some work before?
Yeah, we what we do is we have a meeting to get all of this stuff out on the table. So we have a one-day session which flushes all of this stuff out to remove all the obstacles that I've described. So those obstacles are around some internal corporate fear. So quite often in this type of situation, corporate leaders are fearful of actually saying things which are too difficult to say and not selling their own product. We flush out things like, so the fear is a big issue that we address, and largely by putting relationships back together. There's mantras and generalizations which create roadblocks. So there are statements like, we don't anticipate security will be an issue because we design products from the start, which sounds positive, but actually creates a blind spot. And online is cheaper. Online retail is not cheaper than bricks and mortar. It's actually 20% more expensive. And so there are statements like that and generalizations which create stasis, which create problems. And there's also shifts in thinking, which is about defining the new order. So there's a new order going on here. So there's an emerging new business, and the question is, how do you read that? So there's a recent survey done which said that only 9% of people want to return to their old life, whatever that means. And so if you take the growth in Zoom, for example, depends how you read that. You can either say, well, that's an increase in digital, or you can say that's actually an increase in humanity. And actually, the critical thing is actually to get that decision right. because I think there's a definite shift in terms of a digital detox going on, which is very positive, and it's very important to get that sort of reading the tea leaves right, and also recognize what do good teams look like. So some of the dynamics actually get quite scary, and you're actually liberating the people who really care. And I believe I noticed that the people who really care very often get labeled as being toxic, because they don't sort of fit in. And actually you need these people. And actually this is what I describe as being diversity. So when you start getting this right, you get some interesting dynamics which become a bit difficult to manage. And I think as I said, the things like in tech startups, everybody wants to be Amazon. They won't be Amazon, trust me. It's statistically impossible. And the other challenge with this is to make sure that people are moving fast, and delegating decisions, identifying the heroes, and actually addressing the bad news, because in all of this there's always some bad news. So you've got to be able to address both sides, and it's always difficult to pick up the phone and tell a customer that they're not going to get their product, or you need to double the pricing on a contract. But very often that's what needs to happen.
Yeah, I think for me, it's my biggest fear right now is coming out exactly the same, right? Not using this time to embrace change, but also not getting carried away with the fact that I think you've seen a few businesses who have gone completely remote now, and that might be a cost-saving play by the leadership, or they might have really spent some time looking into the fact that that is the best thing for the company. I think in the time frame they've made the decisions, I find it hard to believe. I mean, take some of our team, a lot of them have loved working from home, and then 2 weeks later, they can't wait to be back into in an office environment, where they can just share those little bits of information, bounce off each other, and the energy to drive each other and learn more than in a very focused remote setting. So my big fear is just that as a business leader, we are not taking the positives from this and really, really spending time drilling down into what are the bits we want to, what's the new normal for us to embrace going forward.
I think that's a very interesting point, Nick. Something I'd add to that, we need to understand more about people. So this one-day program that we run is all about people. So one thing about people is that people, the ideal situation for all of us is to be left alone and do our own thing, right? But that isn't healthy. And I've noticed, because it's teams and interaction that check decision making. So the reason why people get together in a team is to check decision making, and also to make sure we're sort of going in the same direction. So I think there's a comfort at the moment which is not healthy. And when this bubble bursts, it's not a nice bubble to burst. And if people are not prepared, expecting things to turn out the way they will turn out, this simply will not. So I think I'm really concerned about remote working, because what you've just described is all about relationships. And I've noticed as much as people feel more comfortable, I've noticed also relationships are getting more polarized. So people are talking less to each other, and that's very unhealthy. And we are very relational creatures, and we're only as good. I think there's a lot of focus put on individuals, but I think as a team, it's vitally important that teams, because it's only a team that actually improves the decision making. So it's a sum total of people saying what they think to improve something that actually gives you half a chance of hitting the target. Individuals are simply not able to do that. So I'm worried about that quite a lot, and I study the psychology of what's been said very closely using these tools, and I'm concerned that we could be storing up problems for the future.
No. I mean, just to echo that point, I think my experience of the lockdown so far has been my personal productivity has gone through the roof, right? I've gained maybe 2.5 hours for the train journey. I'm, wake up pretty much straight on my phone, into my working day. But that doesn't mean the business gets better because my personal productivity's got better, right? I've sort of forgotten. I've had more of a chance to focus on the projects I wanted to focus on and deliver them. But actually, that's not my job. That's an element of my job. my team, my people, the sort of Eximius family, that's the bit I've got to make sure is pushing forward. And I think it's an addictive drug, though, for high performers who now can perform incredibly well in the stuff they've been maybe lacking on because they've had a bit more time.
Yeah.
But I think there's a danger that they get addicted to that ability to just, deliver their personal work rather than the actual, the bigger picture.
I mean, I think my observation of personal work like that is it doesn't answer the so what, right?
Yeah.
So the world does not run on PowerPoint, Nick, you know that, and reports are utterly useless. So it's only through interaction and teams that things actually happen. So I heard recently that my partners, some people at KPMG were saying exactly the same. Their utilization had gone through the roof, but actually, now I often give the big four a really hard time because they're sitting writing PowerPoints, but they never answer the so what. And I challenged myself on that. So whatever I'm doing, so what? What's the impact of that? And so I think it's productivity is a weird, it's actually what's the impact of. I mean, to be honest, I don't care if I work. I very rarely work long days. In fact, if I do, I drive everybody nuts because I get too much activity going on. Good looks like for me, even difficult situations, I'll turn up early in the morning and I'll go at 3:00. I'll drive home, normally a long commute somewhere, getting stuck on the M25, but it's thinking time. And it's actually what happens when you're not there. So productivity, I think, is a misnomer. I don't care if people get the whole day's job done in 5 minutes. That's fine as far as I'm concerned. So,
yeah, but you can see some of the pressure on leaders to maybe be seen to be productive in this time, right? Rather than actually maybe allowing that time, maybe allowing that day just to think about, spend time working on their business rather than in the business.
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes down to thinking, Nick. So being busy is a great distraction, oddly enough, and it's a great way of avoiding doing what you really need to do. Which is actually to think through some of the tougher things. And I very often see, particularly in distressed businesses, a lot of busyness, but busyness in all the wrong areas and absolutely no thinking. And people do not understand people might think they're talking, but they're not thinking.
Right.
They're going through the motions, and thinking is really important. Otherwise, you just get more of the same. And I think, if you consider some of the factors I've just described, which is falling pricing, falling profitability, pretty business models which are fundamentally broken, like tech businesses employing thousands of people, which shouldn't. They should be doing something much leaner and much meaner. There's always paradoxes, and it's about delivering a product and making money. But I think it comes down to two things. Business comes down to two things: making money, profit, and relationships.
Yeah.
And you can't. Profit and relationships are obviously very closely related. I've never known a business, this is one of my concerns about tech businesses, that actually make sustainable profits without a people relationship. There's no evidence for that. And I think it's, the people side of businesses and the interaction. And to a large degree, this remote working, I don't think is going to positively impact the customer at the end of the day. I think the customer could get a very bizarre experience and get pretty fed up pretty quickly. Because you haven't got that team aspect, and the business is likely to go off on diversions, not focus on what the customer actually wants.
Yeah, and it's just through that that more stagnated feedback loop, right? There's no offhand remarks. There's no passing in the corridor of quick feedback. It's all very organised meeting, very controlled feedback. Yeah, where people are trying to impress, maybe more than actually just talk openly.
Yeah, I think that's right, Nick. I think I learned quite late on in my career that actually, I remember early on in my career when I worked in Lucas, for example, people speaking on the shop floor was a no-no, and I used to spend a lot of my time telling people not to speak to each other. But then I soon realised relationships really matter, and relationships only become important when things get tough. And this is one of the things I think that we've faced is actually when things get tough, the empathy and knowledge we have of each other. So I understand more about you, Nick, and you understand more about me, which is one of the things that we do in this one-day session to repair relationships, so that you get a much closer understanding. Because if things get tough, I tend to think, well, I'm the only person carrying the can, and that's a very common problem for leaders. which I've sort of got over a bit over the years. But it's a very common position, but it's a very bad position to take in terms of how that comes across to other people. And micromanagement is an absolute killer of a business. So these people dynamics and understanding, the interaction and developing empathy, because it's empathy that actually holds together teams in difficult circumstances. And if you haven't got those tools, if you've got that remote team and you turn up the heat too much, the wheels will fall off. And it's very difficult. I rarely have difficult discussions on the phone. I do run this program online, by the way, the one-day program online, because we're trained, we know how to handle, and video can just about pick it up, but we also do quite a lot of pre-prep to mitigate. So we've got people who can actually be a set of eyes and ears, but it's so important, the people side of the business.
Yeah. And I mean, you mentioned toxic people who are deemed to be toxic, Freedom. And do you find this is the time that they come to the forefront of evidencing how they're not toxic? The fact they actually really care about the business, or they're passionate about the business, or they fight for the business?
Yeah, and I think, Nick, the best example of this, if you ever run a customer service department,
right.
What the customers that people always reject are the people who get really upset, right? But the funny thing about those customers is they really care.
Yeah.
Right? And beware of people that don't care, right? So if things are getting bad, who cares? And I really care. My team really care. Trust me. You won't knock the care out of me, okay? But that can make people unpopular, right? Particularly in an easy time when we've got this dynamic around, this sort of sycophantic type fear of upsetting people, or fear of having difficult. Not upsetting is the wrong word, but no one intends to upset people, but fear of having difficult discussions. But I can have a difficult discussion with you if I care about you. I know how to have that type of discussion. And this is where actually the answer to those types of people is not to marginalize them, because they start behaving very badly very quickly, right? But actually those are the people who I use to turn businesses around, right? They're the people who've got the courage and the grit to see things through. And it's interesting to see, for how long and how far they'll go. But these people are very much downtrodden in organizations, and I think they are a huge resource because they really care. Because somebody does not complain or say something awkward, Nick, for the sake of it. They say it because they care, because no one really likes delivering bad news. So I think this is a very, this is one of the things that concerns me when they talk about recruiting for values, right? So as if we all sort of fit into boxes. And my team, I've got a special forces guy in my team. And interesting enough, the thing that holds us together is we both understand psychologically people do not fit into boxes. So even though you and I are quite entrepreneurial, like to do this, that, and the other, and we care about people, trust me, you and I are completely different, and that's great. And we need to value that difference. And at a talk I gave the other day, I said, look, if someone says something to you that you disagree with, right? Don't label them, because the latest thing that's been predominant is to say, well, Tom is ism or ism or dism, one of these ism words, right? Which is very easy because you write them off. You say, well, Tom's that, or he's toxic, and it's very difficult. It's a negative generalization, and you cannot, because it's an irrational statement, it's an irrational label. You cannot get rid of that label, and so there's a real cost to these labels. You need to know how to handle that, because this has become actually very toxic. And the worrying thing about that is you're actually trampling on the people that you really need. So when things get difficult, you need those people. So my observation is that you make everybody feel part of the team. You include them, you value them, you get to know them. You reset relationships, you get rid of all the labels, you become aware of the labels. So if you mention to me a label, or you might add meaning to something that was not actually said, this is one of the reasons why people criticize Trump. They criticize him for what he didn't say very often. And I don't agree with a lot of what he says, but they criticize him for meaning that adding to something he didn't say. And these are all flaws in human psyche. Very comfortable, very easy to reject something and say, Nick is this or Tom is that, and write them off. But these are the people you need in an organization. This is diversity.
That's it, isn't it? That's in a nutshell. I think those last 2 points will resonate hugely with people and every business at the moment I know loves to throw a label on something, and as you're pointing out, more for their own sort of self-worth, and then being, well, I'm now saying defensive and maybe not owning up to the truth around it, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, what I'm taking away from your conversation, like now, if there's ever a time in a cycle, now is the time to be completely true to who you are, what your business is, where you're at, and how you go forward. I would love to put some details at the end of this video of how people can get in contact with you.
Yeah.
It sounds like there's a soft way to engage with you, and there's a more intensive way of doing that. Is there anything else you think at the moment people should just be aware of, or anything that should be on people's radar that people are maybe not looking at so much right now?
Yeah, I mean, there's one thing I'm really concerned about, which is the lack of awareness of, or the inability to process some of the things I've just described. So I think I'd leave people with one message: is when there's an unrealness to this current situation, part of which is denial. But I think the challenge is to consider what happens when this bubble bursts. And it's important to face it, because it's going to be very, very difficult. And some industries, such as retail, are going to get hit very hard. And most retailers will be dead in 2 weeks' time. And some retailers actually have got a future. And this is a vital window to do the things I'm talking about. The difficulty is, without addressing the thinking, some of the things that I've just described, it's actually very difficult to address this stuff, Nick. So there's a distinct danger that people will be saying things like, when we get through this, or when we switch the lights back on, or when the government bail us out for this, because the government are no solution to anything. And there are lots of industries who are, governments never have sorted anything out. So, and it's so important that organisations take ownership and grasp this nettle. But I don't, the weather's good. People are feeling better in themselves, which is great. But there's a really grim reality, unfortunately, Nick, and some really nasty things that have been built up that are not going to go away. So it's vitally important that people act.
Yeah, and start playing out those scenarios and finding other people like yourself or community of people where they can just be real, really. Which again, most leaders tend to isolate themselves into a bubble of just them and a core group of friends, rather than engaging with other thought leaders and other business leaders.
Yeah, and I think I think it's very important to speak to people and read things that you don't want to read. But also, if someone tells you something, and I think very simply, if someone tells you something that you don't like, understand where that person's coming from and don't label them, and really take an interest in them. If you just do that, that would make a substantial difference to your ability to have this 360-degree perspective of what's going on, because otherwise you're actually getting very blinkered. So maybe that's one thing to consider. But maybe I've covered quite a lot of ground, Nick, but this is the nature of a turnaround. You have to move very imperfectly on a lot of things. So I'm hoping that maybe one or two things might resonate with a few people that they can take away. And those things I expect will be entirely different. So when I give talks, some people say, actually very often they talk about the toxic and the people who care, oddly enough. They often play that back to me. But I'm hoping that maybe one or two things that be unique to somebody that someone can act on.
I have no doubt it's resonated with an absolute load of people. Tom, thank you so much for your time this evening. Always a pleasure catching up with you. Yeah. I'll leave some details how to get in contact with you, and we'll catch up again soon.
My pleasure, Nick. Thank you very much for your time.
No, pleasure. Speak soon. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.